You know that feeling when you're reading a contract or even just some instructions and you stop and think, wait, what on earth does that actually mean? It happens to all of us. But imagine that confusing sentence is part of a law. Suddenly, figuring out what it really means becomes one of the most important jobs in the entire legal system. So yeah, let's dive right into how that works. Look, we've all been there, right? You say something and someone takes it the completely wrong way. No big deal usually, but when a law gets misunderstood, whoa, the consequences can be absolutely huge. We're talking about things that can impact people's freedom, their rights, their money, everything. So the big question is, how do we make sure a law, maybe written decades ago, is applied the right way every single time? Okay, let's break this down with a super simple example. Imagine a sign at a park that says, "No vehicles allowed." Seems straightforward, doesn't it? But hold on. What exactly is a vehicle? A car? For sure. But what about an ambulance racing to an emergency? Or a kid's little tricycle? A motorized wheelchair? See? All of a sudden, that crystal clear rule is, well, it's not so clear anymore. This is exactly the kind of puzzle judges have to solve, just with way higher stakes. So, to solve these legal puzzles, there's this whole toolkit called statutory construction. Seriously, the best way to think about it is like a special decoder ring for laws. It's a set of principles, a rule book for reading the rules, that helps judges figure out what lawmakers actually meant. This is so crucial because it makes sure decisions aren't just based on, what a particular judge feels like that day. So here's what we're going to cover. First, we'll tackle what happens when words just aren't clear. Then, we'll look at why a law is like a giant puzzle. After that, we'll get into the sliding scale of meaning, when to be strict and when to be flexible. We'll also touch on the ultimate rulebook that governs everything, and finally, we'll tie it all together to see why this stuff really, truly matters. All right, so we've got our problem, right? Ambiguity. Words can mean different things. So how do you solve that without just letting judges make stuff up? Well, that is exactly where this toolkit comes in. It's all about having a structured process, a method to the madness that makes sure the law is being interpreted, not just invented on the spot. Okay, first big rule from our toolkit, and it's probably the most important one. You can't just read one sentence of a law and think you've got it. No way. You have to think of every law like a giant, complex jigsaw puzzle. If you just stare at one tiny piece, you have no idea what the final picture is supposed to be. You'll get it completely wrong. And this quote just nails it. A law isn't a bunch of random sentences stapled together. It's passed as a single thing with one big goal in mind. That means every little part, every section has to be understood in connection with everything else to create, as it says, a harmonious whole. A word can mean one thing by itself, but when you see it in the context of the whole law, its meaning can totally flip. Let's look at a real-life example to see how this works. A pretty fascinating case called Sojournes. So the court is looking at this property law. One sentence seems super clear. An adverse claim on a property lasts for 30 days. That's it. 30 days and it's gone. But wait. The very next sentence says that after those 30 days, the claim may be canceled by a court. And that's the aha moment. Why would you need a judge to cancel something that already automatically expired? It makes no sense. It's a pointless act. So by reading those two sentences together, the court figured it out. That 30-day clock wasn't an automatic death sentence for the claim. It actually stays in effect until a court steps in and officially cancels it. See? Context is literally everything. Okay, so seeing the whole puzzle is rule number one, but the next tool in the box is pretty cool. It basically says that not all laws get read the same way. Depending on the subject, are we talking about crime, taxes, workers' rights? Judges will actually change how they look at the words. Sometimes they pull out a magnifying glass, and other times they use a much wider lens. And this gets us to the idea of strict versus liberal construction. It's really the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. Strict construction is all about the letter. It sticks to the exact, literal, technical meaning of the words. If your situation doesn't fit in that very specific box, too bad. But liberal construction looks at the spirit. What was the point of this law? What problem was it trying to fix? And it can stretch the meaning to cover situations that fit that purpose, even if the words don't say so explicitly. And this isn't just random. There's a really smart reason for all this. Think about it. Criminal laws, the ones that can put someone in jail, are read liberally, but in favor of the accused. That means any doubt, any ambiguity benefits the person on trial. Makes sense, right? But flip it for tax exemptions.
Those are read strictly in favor of the government. You want to get out of paying taxes? You better prove you fit that rule to a T, because the government needs that money to run. And then you have labor laws, which are read liberally to help the worker. It's a whole system of checks and balances, all based on public policy.
All right, now we get to the golden rule, the big one, the rule that trumps every other rule we've talked about. And it's this: no matter how you twist or turn a law, no matter how clever your interpretation is, it can never, ever go against the Constitution, period. This is the absolute foundation of the whole legal system. This whole idea is called constitutional supremacy, and it starts with a simple assumption. Every law is, well, assumed to be constitutional. So let's say a law could be read two ways. Interpretation A is totally fine, but interpretation B would make it unconstitutional. Well, the judge doesn't have a choice. They must go with interpretation A. It's like the ultimate tiebreaker, a built-in failsafe that keeps everything in line with the highest law of the land.
And get this, the Constitution kind of has its own mini user manual for how to read it. It's pretty logical. First, just read the words and give them their normal everyday meaning. Simple. If that doesn't work and it's still ambiguous, then you dig into the intent. What were the framers trying to accomplish? And most importantly, you have to read the whole thing as one cohesive document, so one section doesn't accidentally destroy another.
So we've gone through this whole decoder ring, this toolkit of rules for reading rules. And I get it. It can all feel a little abstract, a little academic, but it's not. So let's get down to it. Why should you care? Why does any of this matter in the real world? Here's why it matters. This whole system is what gives us predictability. It gives us fairness. It ensures we live under a rule of law, not a rule of whoever is the judge that day. It prevents a system where the outcome depends on a judge's personal opinion or, I don't know, what they had for breakfast. It is the invisible architecture holding up a stable and trustworthy legal system. So here's the thought I want to leave you with. The next time you're scrolling through the news and you see a headline about some court decision that just seems bizarre or totally counterintuitive, before you just write it off as a crazy ruling, stop and ask yourself a question. What rules were they using to read the rules? Were they stuck with a strict literal reading, or were they looking at the spirit of the law? Were they trying to solve a puzzle to make two parts of a statute that seem to contradict each other actually work in harmony? Maybe they had to pick a weird-sounding interpretation because the other option would have been unconstitutional. Because when you start to understand this toolkit, you're not just learning how to read a law. You're learning to understand the very logic of how our justice system works.